So wonderful to be here, although it will be for a short period of time. First of all, let me congratulate you with organizing this event. I think it's extremely important to have those discussions all together about open science and open data, which, as you probably already discussed today, is a very complex issue with many different aspects. But for us as a university, it's of course extremely important that we are very open in what we do, but also really share our data with the wider community, but also if we generate data to make it accessible to others. Because I think it's really a pity if you generate data only once and don't reuse it. I saw in your program that you had a whole discussion about fair data, and being a scientist myself, in particular coming from the human field, it's usually patients or the general public that participates in providing the information that generates the data. And I think it's also in their interest that we use it in the best possible way. So it's not only that we have to think on how we indeed reward our scientists, but also our participants in that we do the best with the data and the results they were involved in. But indeed, this session, the next session is about rewards and recognition, and that is of course a very important issue for the entire university as well. And it's also a challenging one, because it means that if we really want to adhere to all those principles, we also have to reward and recognize scientists for adding to this either a community, but also for providing their data in an open way. And I saw that also Marian Joëls is on the panel, so that's really nice because she is also on a national panel, and I think it's really important that we think all together on how we're going to do this. I remember from my past that Barend Mons from Leiden University once also came with ideas on how we can really reward people that, for example, generate data or make data accessible to others. And I think that's something we have to formalize. What does it mean indeed to be adhering to an open data and open science community? So I really hope that after this afternoon, you also have good ideas for us as a committee on how we can implement this even better. So that's also been in so that also that is done in a fair way, because we also have to be able to discuss with each other, right? What we expect then from people on how to do this, and when do we all find that you're really contributing to this open science community. So yes, I really hope you're going to help me in that respect. I hope you have a very inspiring and interesting discussion this afternoon. And once more, Vera, thank you for organizing all of this and taking the lead in this very important program. And I'm really looking forward to hear what's coming out of these discussions. So for now, have a wonderful rest of your meeting.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Cisca Wijmenga. It's really nice to hear, and I completely agree that it's an enormous challenge we face. And well, it will be great if this discussion that we're having now could contribute or advise our committee at our university. Thank you so much for your introduction. And then I will go on to introducing our chair, Tina Kretschmer, Professor Tina Kretschmer. She's a professor at the Pedagogical Sciences at the Faculty of Behavior and Social Sciences. She is also the chair of the Young Academy at Groningen. She's co-founder of the Open Science Community Groningen, the OSCG, which we see in the background here, and also a member of the steering committee Open Science for the Open Science of our university. We are thrilled to have you as our moderator, Tina. And I think I will give you the floor because I think you might want to introduce our different panel members.
Thanks a lot, Vera. So before I start, I was wondering, is it possible for you to put everyone who is not a presenter into a different mode, because right now I have to switch between several different panels to see the people who are on the panel. So I have a lot of gray little icons in between as Flávio, but I don't see any of the other panel members. And I think it's very difficult to moderate if that is the case. And I think it works to make everyone who is not a panel member a participant rather than a presenter. But I'm not sure.
The only thing is that if we do that, then they lose their right to ask questions in the chat. So we could do that, but then we have to, well, see whether people show their hands and want to voice their questions vocally.
Okay, is there another way that I could, because I can't see, I can only see one panel member, so it's, for me, it's impossible to see when someone else wants to say something.
They are present. Maybe the panel members can put on their camera. Would that be a solution? That at least in
I still see, so I have to switch between different windows to be able to see. So I can't see everyone at the same time.
Okay. So should we then do your first suggestion, and then the people would raise their hand if they have questions as a participant?
I don't know. What do you want me to do?
Yeah, I think I would prefer to leave it like this, to leave the option open that people could ask also questions in the chat during the discussion. But maybe all the panel members could switch on their videos.
I think they do have. I apologize to panel members in advance if I missed that you want to say. You may have to raise your hand, or you may just have to unmute yourself, because I can't see all of you at the same time. But I will try to do my best.
Hello, Tina. We're here.
I will give you the floor, Tina.
Well, I've just looked, just as kind of like swiped through all the different panels, and I've seen all of you, so I'm glad to have you all here. So I also want to welcome everyone to this panel discussion. Very honored to be able to chair and moderate this, and I also have the honorable task to first introduce all the panel members. And so I've gone through everyone's Maper page and thought about the things that I know about the panel members, because I think I know all of you in person except for one, and that's the first one I want to introduce. That's Flávio, Dr. Flávio Eiró, and I will try and find you in my panels. Yeah, there you are. Not sure, I think I mispronounced your surname, so I think it must be something like Eiró. Okay, great. Who got his degrees from universities in Brazil and in France, and is now assistant professor in the Faculty of Arts, specifically in the group of minorities and multilingualism. And Flávio is also an open science ambassador for his faculty. I would also like to welcome Professor Marian Joëls, who's a professor of neuroscience and the dean of the medical faculty. Professor Joëls is also a member of the University of Groningen Open Science Steering Committee. Then I welcome Marijke Leliveld, who is assistant professor at the Faculty of the Faculty of Economics and Business, and researches ethics and sustainability in a business context. Hot off the press are the news. Sorry, I could not stop myself. That Marijke has also just been promoted to associate professor today. So congratulations, I guess, from all of us. And I'm particularly interested, actually, then in your views on how open science practices can play a role in promotion decisions, and with regards to criteria for promotion. Also welcoming Merle-Marie Pittelkow, I think that's how you pronounce the name, I should be able to, PhD researcher at the Faculty of Behavioural and Social Sciences, who studies research practices in biomedical studies and biomedical research, and is a board member of the Open Science Community Groningen. And last but not least, Professor Mladen Popovic, who is Dean of the Faculty of Theology and Religious Studies, and is part of the University of Groningen Reward and Recognition Committee. So you see that for most of the panel members, a focus on their connection to open science, but it's really nice, Mladen, to have you here as well as a representative of the reward and recognition paper, because as we all know, these two terms were coined in the position paper that FSNU and other parties have published in, I think it was 2019 or late 2000, no, it was 2019. And basically the position paper suggested that there needs to be room for everyone's talent. And in the last few years, we've been debating open science very often connected to the reward and recognition, to the position paper. So what I did actually was I went back to that position paper and had a very close look at how open science is discussed in that position paper. And it's like when our rector just opened this panel, I thought it's interesting because actually I think she used other types of definition, other examples. So the position paper, the reward and recognition paper, focuses on, let me see, sharing outcomes with society. So that may be open access, make research findings accessible, and involve society, for instance, in terms of citizen science. I'm curious to your opinions as to whether these kinds of examples capture what you think is open science. So Mladen, I see you nodding. So yes, I did.
If you want me to start.
Mladen, I see you nodding.
Okay. Maybe as our rector Magnificus said, this is, I think, also very important to get ideas. Why? You have this position paper, which is a national paper, and then we are looking at concretely how at different universities things are being tackled. And I think in our committee here at the University of Groningen, we have said, well, let's not yet focus on the whole open science, because we also have that as a separate committee, a group working at the university, and we have focused therefore on issues of, for example, team science, also with input from the Young Academy of Groningen, and other career tracks, say with regard to teaching and so on. So the whole aspect of open science as such has not been in there, but the differentiation of different career tracks may give rise to also include it. But at the moment, it's not a topic on itself anymore in how we are implementing it in Groningen. But as Cisca said, it's also good to see what kind of ideas are there and whether that should still stay in the open science committee, which is also here at the RUG, or whether we can also use that and have, as we say, a Proofdown. I don't know how you say that in English, as different faculties are working with different experiments, testing grounds, as it were, for the various aspects of recognition and rewards.
From what I know, most of these Proofdowns, so testing, whether experimental labs, I suppose, focus on teaching, right? Can you imagine anything in terms of Proofdown experiments in terms of open science? And obviously other members of the panel can also comment. Or are you aware of any of those practices being trialed within, for instance, promotion committees, or when people are hired? Does open science play a role already when we evaluate people?
Yeah, good question. I would like to hear from others. I would say, yeah.
I can kind of contribute to that. So within economics and business, the faculty, I mean, a part of the new tenure track criteria, for example, is also the citizenship and service to the faculty and to the department. And one of the examples is open science. So it's one of the ways to show your citizenship, etc. But it's kind of optional, right? So it's not in that sense embedded. I also think, I mean, it's really depending on how you define open science. It really depends on whether you can really kind of include it as like it's something that you have to do, because it really depends on it. And again, what I already kind of also said in the chat in one of the previous presentations, one of the issues we face here is, for example, that people use data from companies. They're just not allowed to share that. So, I mean, you can make it fair still so that people are able to somehow access it, but it's really much more complicated than just kind of sharing data which you collected yourself. And it makes it a bit difficult. And it's related to what the journals kind of say and want you to do. So it's very much focused on what the journals kind of want us to do as researchers. So I think that's the reason why so far in economics and business it's optional. It's one of the ways to show, and I think that at least is a very good first step. But it's not structural based, given all these issues. That's basically the reason why people are a bit hesitant to make it bigger.
Yeah, maybe I can add something as well. So maybe also related to the first question, the relationship between open science on the one hand and recognition and reward on the other hand. So if you look at the national program of open science, there are indeed 3 pillars, as Cisca mentioned. So it's open access, which very much is actually determined by the deals with publishing houses. The second pillar is open data, so that's more fair data, like Marijke also just said. And the third pillar is open science, which is more about participation of citizens, or in our case, patients. So those are the 3 pillars. And then there are more enabling factors like the culture, the academic culture, which is related to recognition and reward, but also things like infrastructure is a very important enabler for all these things. So that's the national program on open science. On the other hand, you have the recognition and reward movement. And there, one of the things that is discussed is how we should change the criteria for instance, promotion or determining the academic achievements of individuals or teams. And then open science can be one of the criterions on which the promotion is founded. Now that is not so advanced yet. So I think other things, as Mladen said, other things are taken up with priority, like a differentiation of careers, having clear procedures. But now at the next stage is also how do we involve other indicators of achievement other than the classical metrics in the promotion criteria. So then you can think of, for instance, open access, the number of, or the percentage of open access publication, which is not always something you can steer, but at least you can indicate what effort you have taken to make your publications open access. For instance, you can think of the use of data sets. You can post your data sets in protected environments, and you can actually see how often those data sets are being used. You can also think of rewarding development of new tools like packages in R that a lot of people can use, and it's an open platform for statistical approaches. So I think we're just at the start of thinking how that can be involved in the promotion system, academic reward system. I think it's important that the most difficult part is the change in the culture, because we are used to judge the achievements of academics in a certain way, and people feel comfortable about it because they know exactly what counts and what doesn't count. And we need an open mind, literally an open mind, to regard that in a different way and to think how we can change the portfolios in order to also reward efforts of people to do something for the greater benefit in a different way than just a scientific publication.
Merle, you want to react to that?
Yeah, I think you're making a very valid point there, which is to open up the whole promotional system to more parts of the research output than just the very end product, the publication, which is what we've used for the past, I don't know how many decades. of a sentence that I hear oftentimes when we talk about these things is that we need a culture change first for evaluating or kind of setting up a system to change our incentive structure. But I think it's actually the other way around. I actually think that culture change is going to take us even more decades. It's something that's very slow. It's something that needs a lot of change from different actors within a network. And I don't see that happening, at least in the next 10 years. What I see happening, though, is changes in the incentive structure and changes in the way that we evaluate research work, which will eventually lead to this culture change. And I think that's a very important classifier for me personally, at least, is that the culture change will follow the changes in the incentive system or the changes in the way that we do value researchers.
Well, in a way, I do agree with you. The problem is that the people that change the system are usually the ones that are slightly on the conservative side. A notable exception is, for instance, how Zonneweg and MWO have changed the criteria for the personal grants, asking for, let's say, 10 highlights, and that can be anything from a publication to, well, whatever a book you wrote for the lay public. So there was a lot of criticism on that, and I know that you probably have followed that discussion also in the newspapers. There's a lot of opposition, and we need to join forces to change that, because there's still a lot of people in high and influential positions that like to keep the system as it is. And we shouldn't throw away the good parts of it. That's, I think, very important to say.
Flávio?
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to join a bit, I think, my colleagues, and raise and really make it explicit a few of the challenges that I think are present when we think about rewarding open science, right? And I say that from a very disciplinary and perhaps career stage perspective that I want to share with you, but I think we need to watch out for how we're going to reward open science practices in terms of open access, and open science practices can also be a reproducer of inequalities. Who can afford open access? These are grant holders that are limited. These are research centers that are also limited. We rely on these agreements that are limited in terms of quotas, but also in terms of which universities have that access to that, right? So all these little, all these components are also in a way enablers of a system where less privileged scholars without grants, or from universities or countries with less funding, will have to pay to have their articles open access or not, and then they're going to be less read and less cited, because that's one thing that we know is that open access articles are more cited, right? Another limitation is the anonymity and protection of sources. I work with people, right? And we need to consider the wishes of those people when we are, of these research participants, when we are doing this. Even with anonymized data, we have to think of, for example, flexible embargo periods that then will have to be taken into account when we are rewarding open science and open access publications. Declaration of consent is also something that needs to be revised. And what do we do with our previous research that we want to now make it open if we didn't ask our participants then if they would agree with that? Not all research can actually be made completely open. Individual inductive research, for example, has to be published first, because it's not always possible to separate data from analysis. This is not something that it's evident for all disciplines. Some disciplines work with political sensitive data that can be misused or misinterpreted if published without proper analysis following it. Long-term projects such as PhDs or others will require more time in order to produce really innovative research. Do you really want to not reward them for not stepping ahead and publishing publishing their data? Also mind early career researchers that keep switching from university to university. Who does that data belong to? How does one university recognize open science in relation to the other? Where to store that data? And so all of this comes together to how we're going to, what kind of rewarding model we're going to create. Considering that open access, open science is not for everyone all the time, that there are different timelines there, and how can we reward it fairly and not just be tapping ourselves on the back for something that only we as privileged scholars in a privileged position have the conditions to do, and then enabling this for example, journals or publishers to keep charging other people to publish, right? So these are just a few of the challenges that I'm sure you all are aware of, that we have to keep in mind when we are designing those recognition and rewarding models.
Merle, did you want to react?
Yeah, I lowered my hand again because I think this is a very difficult area and a very difficult topic, and it's very great that you bring this up, the inequalities that the open science movement or the open research movement has within itself. One of the things that I was thinking about immediately is this sort of conception or perception that we have now, that if we reward open science practices, that would mean that everyone has to practice open science. That would mean that everyone has to share the data, which I don't think is what we're aiming for, right? The only thing that we want to do is diversify the things that researchers can do. And that would mean that if someone has no option or is not able for whatever reason, be it sensitive data, be it resources, be it their supervisor saying, no, we don't want to share our data, to not open up the data, they should not be punished for that. Rather, someone who has the abilities should also show this effort. I know that this introduces an inequality in a sense that that person will then, with the same track record, probably have a better picture in the end. And I don't have a solution for this, but I think it's at least a solution for what we heard in the morning, like not morning, but in one of the previous sessions where someone was saying, well, we don't have anything to show for, let's say, a year of work if I don't have a publication. And I think that's one of the advantages that I see if we advise or promote open science practices, that we do open it up to more diverse outputs of research. But again, that doesn't tackle the issue of inequality, which is why I was hesitant to add this to your comment, because I don't want to defer from that point. It's very important.
If I may, Tina.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that I agree with you, and I had the same struggle where bringing those up, I also don't want to come across as being against these initiatives. And I think what the topic that we were discussing before is a good answer for that. We should be trying things, right? Because there's no way, we shouldn't be holding ourselves to pilot some ideas because of the risks they take. We should be trying them. And I know, we all are aware of some initiatives here and there that are being successful. I think one of the points be then to make those initiatives, or to make our efforts more inclusive as possible. So for example, when we're talking about open access, which is just the last bit of the open science trajectory, right? Instead of focusing on, for example, percentage of publications from the RUG or from the Netherlands that are being open access now, let's focus on how many journals can we flip to a full open access model. And I know this is possible. I know commercial publishers that are doing that. If they get enough libraries committed to fund a certain journal, they will flip the journal full access to everyone, not just to those paying journals. If all the universities would be doing that to some journals, some initiatives here and there, we would have a much more inclusive, open landscape of publications, right? Outputs.
Right, so you're just referring to the unintended negative consequences that we might have in the endeavor. And I think that's a very important point. We were asked to prepare for this session by thinking about like concrete things that we would promote, kind of suggest. And the only thing I could think about is monitor our implementation of interventions, because I think the train has left the station. We heard this earlier as well, right? I'm just reusing words that people used here. Open science is a thing, and open science will happen in the future. But we need to be mindful of the negative consequences that some of these initiatives might have. And we need to have several steps in the process of, for example, changing the promotional structure at our university, which I'm very excited about. But we need steps in the process where we will be reevaluating whether we're actually achieving what we're setting out to achieve. And I think that's a very important point that we now need to be thinking about how we're going to do that in the end.
I want to ask you, because Marijke has put a point in the chat that actually made me think about some other things that I wanted to discuss with you. Marijke, your point is with integrating open science practices in evaluation criteria mean that we lower the standards and other things. And that's actually something which I also found in the reward and recognition statement in the position paper, that it takes longer to engage in open science practices, and I don't have the direct quote here, but engage in open science practices takes longer than a publication. So we should be mindful of that. So will that mean that in the near future, I may not have the publications that I should have for promotion, but I have, you know, papers in progress, basically, or papers in preparation. To what extent is that fair? So to what extent is that a situation that we would aspire? To what extent are we willing and fine with a situation where other indicators, where we accept lower standards than other indicators?
Well, I think to me, what is the most important thing is what it means for the advancement of science. And I think COVID has really learned us that sharing data, working together, trying to find the possibilities amongst the rules and regulations, which of course we know, but then together with, for instance, the Ministry of Health, we have looked at what is possible rather than what isn't possible, and that has really accelerated the advancement in our understanding of COVID treatment and vaccination. So, and of course there are downsides. We have to be very careful who's using that information for the wrong reasons. But I think it has actually proven that it's accelerating science. And I can give another example in which I was personally involved, in which, for instance, we developed a tool where we use historic data, so just reuse of data, the R of FAIR, to get better power of animal experimentation, and it just shows by reusing data you can get better science. So I don't see why it should be something that's, you know, is supporting a regression to the mean. We have to be aware of it, but in my view, open science, working together, sharing data is something that potentially increases the possibility of science.
Marijke, I think you also wanted to contribute something.
Yeah, so I fully agree. I think it's good to kind of look at the meta level, that I think open science is just good for science in general. The big problem, of course, every time is that for the individual promotion decisions, it's always an individual level. So what I hear, I mean, there's people very much like in favor of it, but there's also people a bit more hesitant to think about it, because it's, to what extent can you really kind of say that if you are like in a team working together on a certain topic, that you actually kind of really contributed sufficiently, right? So it's very difficult to kind of get it out, or it's easy maybe even to kind of free ride maybe even such a progress. And there's people like saying, and that's I'm definitely not one of those, but people are saying like, yeah, but if you open up everything and just share it, I mean, for countries who don't want to participate, who don't do it, they're just very happy, right? It's just free money, etc. So those are the things that I hear, for example, within my own faculty, and therefore they kind of like focus on like, this is, at least you have to publish, because that's somehow a stamp of approval, and that's why they remain it. So I find it very difficult to kind of also tackle the discussion and to say, to kind of like make a counter argument, like, okay, so if we have lowered the standards on traditional publishing, for example, or whatever, that it lowers the quality of the people working here, and as such, the accreditation and et cetera, et cetera. That makes it sometimes a bit difficult because they just see it like it's in the end an individual decision for example, promotion, and as such, it's very difficult to kind of incorporate it and to really establish whether a person contributed to this open science or was just, well, it's more on paper than it actually was.
Doesn't your really show that the current system is holding us back? If I, for instance, compare to companies, to businesses, they rarely look at the individual. They usually look what the output of the team was, and because that's what counts for their results as a company. So I think it's, if the promotion of individuals is the thing that's holding us back, then we should seriously consider whether that's a good element of our current system.
Merle, I think you had your
Fully
from
agree.
you I
Yeah.
see two raised hand. So I'm not sure. At least I give you one.
Yeah, that's
And
okay. I'm
Flávio,
sorry. I'm just raising and lowering my hand here all the time. I'm changing my mind constantly. All good. So one of the things I wanted to unpack there is that it sounded to me that you, Marijke, are suggesting that it's easier to kind of freeload on a team effort or a team project, which I would personally disagree with, especially in times where we do have the credit taxonomy. It's very easy to clearly and transparently illustrate what the individual contribution of a person is, especially when it comes to big team efforts. I think that's just immensely important, and that's also something that we're working on, which is easy to show off after. The second part that I wanted to respond to is the idea of the promoting the individual. And I think Richard McAlrath actually has a really lovely kind of analogy there with the chicken coop, where he's talking about chickens who apparently are cannibalists, which I didn't know for, and they have a evolutionary advantage if they're picking at other people, right? They know that by picking at others, by eating their eggs, by these sorts of things, they're going to be lovely, Tina. I hope they're not eating each other. Anyways, right. So by picking each other, by being aggressive, they have an advantage, right? I think it's very similar in the field of research, and he's making this analogy of the system that we're having at the moment, where it's publish or perish, where we're being evaluated in our individual kind of output. It leads to a system where people are cutting corners, where people are being bullied, where we have manipulation of data and that sorts of things. And I don't think that has served as well in the past. But there I'm just repeating what Marian has just said, right? And I think it's worth a shot then to think about lowering the idea that we put on the individual and trying to incorporate more team efforts in science.
Flávio.
Yeah, I wanted to add two things here to resonate with my colleagues. I think the first one is that when we start considering, I mean, Tina, your question, like your provocative question, and are we lowering other standards or not? I think there's one way that we can look at that doesn't really raise that problem, and that is we should also be valuing academic practices that are now invisible. So, for example, to give like one example of this whole discussion, open science, is peer review. We all do peer review. We know that it's essential work for academic life, but peer review is something that is hidden. We don't really have access to it, and we don't value it properly. Maybe we add on our CVs the journals that we have reviewed for, but that's it, right? And there's a whole movement within the open science framework trying to make peer review also, first of all, more transparent, more open, and that also that we can be more valued and recognized by that work that we do. That is very important, and then in no way is really rewarded today. The other thing that I want to say is that also resonating with what Marian had said is that the idea that open research is collaboration, right? So we should give incentives for collaboration, fine. Sometimes we can put our data sets online for the whole world to see, that's good, but sometimes we cannot do that, but we can still reward collaboration. So for example, between researchers, between departments, between faculties, the focus then of course should be avoid the exploitation of early career researchers and PhDs, which already happens, and that's not really collaboration, fine. But besides that, why not create incentives for researchers to go on and say, hey, will you join me to interpret this data? I don't have time for it now, resources, or I don't have the complementary perspective here, so I would like my colleagues to join me and do that as well in another, it could be in the same department, could also be in another faculty even. And this is also part of open science, right? Not just within our immediate colleagues, but perhaps the university could be an instance that would reward that. And this, of course, the same goes for collaborations with research participants, with practitioners, that can increase the impact of our research as well. Basically, I've been seeing people literally just sharing their project in public and saying, hey, who wants to join me in this one? And then looks what happened. Look who wants to join. Look who can contribute to that. And it doesn't need to be in a completely anarchist way where anybody can just come and grab your data and go do whatever you want. But this dialogue can be done in a very open way, but still in the terms or within the limits that the nature of your research demands.
Mladen.
Thank you. Yes, so many exciting things going on, and there's so many things I would like to respond to, but maybe first focus on one thing, and this discussion now on lowering standards and say in relation to promotion criteria. And there, of course, there's also a choices you can make where people put their efforts in, as it were, and how you recognize it and also then reward it. You know, for example, in promotions, but also in general, how our research is being evaluated and assessed. It's now not called anymore the standard evaluation protocol, but the strategy evaluation protocol. And there, for example, you can say, well, you know, with publications, we want to really focus on quality and not so much quantity. And if you make those kinds of choices, you also have to then implement that in your promotion criteria. And then, you know, this is for me a thinking about what we say about lowering standards. What do we mean? I don't think anyone means lowering quality standards, but it's maybe the amount of work that we are doing. And for me, this thinking about it in this way also connects with the question we as panelists received from you when thinking about open research practices at our university. Should we have that centralized or faculty specific? And Flávio in his first contribution emphasized also the different disciplines that we have, and that to me would then say it's not either or, you know, central or faculty, but you have to also take into account the different disciplinary practices that there are at our university. I think that is very important, and it's a point I would like to raise here.
A little bit connected to that, I want to kind of like maybe put in another controversial thing. So when I'm totally a proponent of open science, right? I was a board member of when we founded the open science community and so on. But when I talk to people, I sometimes get the impression that open science for quite a few is, and I'm not even talking about the culture of senior academics, basically. I'm talking about people like peers. And then, so I remember someone last year saying that before they submitted their Veni, they had to still submit or like upload preprints for everything just so that it would count as open science. And also another memory I had was kind of like this idea that, okay, we could ask people to run open science, but it would look good on their CVs. So I wonder also, will open science practices, aren't we running a bit of a risk to have yet another tick box, have yet another hurdle? And Flávio, I was also thinking when you said we need to make invisible practices visible, so that kind of, I'm a little bit afraid that it becomes yet another list of things early career researchers have to adhere to in addition to everything else, right? Merle.
Yeah, this fear very much resonates with me, and also with a lot of things that I hear from other PhD students, like, oh, I need to do all these extra things, it's just going to take me extra time. Which is also why I'm personally very much in favor of lowering some of the standards, right? It's about diversification. It's about having more ballpoints, but not needing to score as high on each of those levels as we previously had to. And I think that's something that we need to be very mindful of and talk about in discussion, that you don't have to excel on all of these aspects, right? You don't have to have all of your projects being preprints, even though I wouldn't hate that personally, but that doesn't need to be the goal. It's one thing that you will also be valued on, but that doesn't mean that you have to excel in everything.
So that would be from an early career researcher's perspective, this is what you hope will be the reality, or like that's a wish.
Right. Of course, it's a wish, right? I haven't gone through any promotional decisions within universities. I've got my PhD. I don't even have the PhD. I just have the position, right? So I'm not experienced in that regard. But for example, for my PhD project, I have one registered report, and I'm just hoping that registered report, which does take a bit longer, I think people are vastly exaggerating on how much longer it takes, but let that be as it is. I hope that that's going to count towards my output with a bit more weight than, let's say, 2 normal publications. And I'm hoping that there's going to be a balance, right? So maybe my output is not going to look as pretty as other people's outputs is, but I have a few points on the open science scale, and that's just kind of going to add to each other. That's my hope, at least.
Great, thanks. Thanks for your contribution. I think Flávio, you were next, and then Marijke, I believe, and then Marian.
Yeah, I just want to make a quick point about the invisible practice being made mandatory from day to night, and then suddenly we have one more thing hanging around above our heads. I think again, following a bit Merle's perspective here, from a very personal perspective, I would prioritize the practices that are already overburdening early career researchers and PhDs. So these are, for example, I gave the example of peer review. That's something that I started doing when I was a PhD, because I hoped that this would advance my career as well, and I hope that my recognition of my expertise would increase. But we face quite quickly the fact that these are very limitedly rewarded practices. The same thing would go, for example, for data sets, if we were talking about this earlier. For some disciplines, PhDs are the ones collecting data, right? Why not then prioritize the recognition for those data sets to PhDs or early career researchers who did the data collection? So if the publications later, PhDs are going to be included, but there's a whole research team around it that's going to be, the PhD is going to be one within 10 co-authors. But the data was that PhD collected. Why not then give the priority, let's say the first authorship, so to say, to that PhD, or even the sole authorship of that data to the PhD? And that's a way that to balance out a bit what Merle was saying, to balance out this inequalities that we cannot change the whole world from day to night, maybe, but this is something that we could do. We could get the PhDs to be recognized fully for the data they generated, even if it's in the context of a bigger research, where we cannot really, where the results later will be shared and the outputs will be shared with a bigger team. So this is an example. Then I would prioritize those kind of extra recognition front, so to say.
Yeah, Marijke.
Yeah, so I would like to kind of answer, or get back to the question, like, is it okay if people kind of strategically start to use this open science things, like indeed, like doing it just so they can tick off a box or whatever? On the one hand, of course, on a higher level, I don't want people to do that. On the other hand, it can also lead to a change. But what I find more problematic is that it will be a tick off box for basically early career researchers, mainly because they are the ones trying to get tenure and to get to a higher level in the hierarchy. I think it's very important that, and maybe even more important, that also the seniors are actually, it's part of their kind of RNO meetings or whatever, that they can show what they contributed to it, because that incentivizes them to also kind of help the early career researchers, the PhD students, etc. But in essence, I don't think it's necessarily bad if, like, for a temporary moment of time, that people are kind of, maybe some people are using it strategically. I mean, some people, majority of people here probably are very much in favor of open science, but also that the conservatives maybe first do it because they have to. But I mean, that also changes culture, right? If everybody just kind of get used to this process, then it's just normal. So I'm not necessarily against people initially using it kind of strategically to bump their CV, because I do believe that it can also help making the culture change.
Marian.
Yeah, I think we had earlier the discussion whether we should start with the culture or start with the deeds. I still think that, well, we should do both, but the culture is essential, because for 30 years the culture has been such that publishing papers in high-ranked journals was the standard, and that was, what we had to do. So everything else was regarded as a waste of time. I'm exaggerating, but this is more or less how people felt it. So it starts with people that are in charge of science policy, and the rector, of course, is one of those people, and there the deans, and from there the departmental heads, etc., etc. But the entire system from top to bottom should explain that we can differentiate. It's important that a unit or a department has all the different types of career to be versatile and prepared for a challenging environment, but the individual doesn't have to do everything. So that brings us back to recognition and reward. I think it's good to have differentiated careers. Some are more at the basic science end of the spectrum, and others are more at the applied, but it's all necessary. We need the entire change from fundamental research to the application in society. And we have all been steered in a direction, including myself, that it's the publication that counts, and anything that comes after that is, well, sort of charity. But we should start to accept that this is not how the public thinks, and the public actually funds research. So part of us should take the time and the effort and be inspired by bringing the findings in the publication to their application in society. So I think that's the most important thing that we need to keep saying, because things will not change. If we have the implicit message that the only thing that counts is the publication, then the entire community will produce publications and not much else.
Thanks for kind of like getting the discussion to that point, because one thing I still want to discuss, and there are a few aspects to it that I want to discuss, is this reluctance that we had from senior academic in the summer with that letter that they wrote, right? Kind of basically not so much talking about open science as such, but defending journal impact factors as a very, very decisive criterion, and also basically suggesting that without these kinds of clear-cut sort of objective criteria, we won't be able to be a competitive, we won't be able as Netherlands to be competitive in science. In fact, the letter also called open science political rather than a scientific aspect. So that in mind, and that was signed by a lot of senior academics, that in mind, also in the position paper, the suggestion that, I think, Mladen, you just said, the SEP, the Strategy Evaluation Protocol, will involve open science, or should involve open science. So that means that managers, that deans, that departmental directors of research, they will have to keep their senior academics in check. So they will have to, in some way, force open science practices upon them, right? So I'm just wondering what your opinions or what your perspectives are on this kind of tension between this idea of open science practices, this wanting a culture change, this young or like early career, mid-career researchers engaging in these practices, and this reluctance from a senior level that maybe we can't afford for very much longer. So how will you as deans deal with this in practice? Marian.
Yes, I very much like to respond to this, because I was actually involved in some of the discussions. I think the first thing I want to say is that there is a serious concern, and this concern is what I phrased before, that by doing this, we are taking away the attention of researchers from their work, and its regression to the mean. So that is something we should be aware of, and actually make clear that that's not the case. There are many upsides of doing open science, and we shouldn't forget them. Now, that's one thing. So that's I'm convinced this stems from a serious concern. At the same time, as I said, I was part of the discussions, and already the way that it's being done is quite intimidating. So because these are very high up people, and they're very, they have a very strong record, and the way they phrase their concerns makes it very difficult for younger scientists to raise anything opposite to it. And we have to, I think, especially the senior people that have a similar CV, I have to say, are you aware that 40% of your PhD students are probably highly stressed out? Because that's the average in the Netherlands, and there's no reason to believe that it's different in the labs from these people. And the downside of this attitude is that good people leave the arena because they don't like the atmosphere any longer. And that's not because they're not so successful scientists, but because they don't like the atmosphere and they like to work in a different atmosphere. we also lose the support of the lay public and the politicians if we only reason from our point of view and don't listen to them because we position ourselves as the only experts. Of course, there is a difference in knowledge and expertise and skills, etc. But still, the concerns people bring up, the general public, is something to listen to. So I think everyone really, we have to listen to what this group says, and there's really some truth in it. But at the same time, we have to also oppose it because otherwise the system is never going to change. And just to give an example, I recently was in a committee that was deciding on membership of Learned Society, and there was still mention of the impact factor of the journals. And it was so not compliant with the DORA rules. And of course, I'm in a position, I feel safe enough to say that this is not the way we should look at it anymore. But people that are not so high up in the hierarchy, I can imagine that they feel intimidated and they think it's hopeless and they just leave the arena, which is a waste, it's a pity. And especially women, I'm afraid.
Thanks a lot for your openness. Mladen.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, your question, what we as deans do, I agree with Marian, you know, if you have a position, but it's also a matter of time, because you can say, here at my faculty, it's a very different discipline, but years ago already we decided less publications, so less on quantity, but the quality you have to remain. So you have there some sort of minimal requirement. Yet at the same time, you have to think about what people put their efforts in and that you appreciate that. And people can show then clear results. But it's also good, I think, to emphasize that, you know, this discussion over the summer, and Marian was also referring to it, I think it's important to keep a balance in all of it. And where on the one hand, say, journal impact factors and that discussion has gone too far, we should also not be too simplistic about going, say, all onto the narrative only. I hear especially also from the humanities, you might think, oh, they would love narrative, but I really think for a balance, and the SEP still allows for that. You know, giving the possibility of also saying, well, substantiate you have the possibility to substantiate your narrative with robust data. But yeah, I think for the different fields, I think the most important thing is it takes time, and you have to show and repeat it also in your faculty that it is not about how many articles you have published this year, but was it a very good one? And instead of say publish 10 articles, I would say 1 or 2 excellent ones, and that's it. But that takes time because people, many have said now, and Marian especially also, we've been used to working in a kind of way. So it takes also a lot of repetition and it takes time, but I think we have to emphasize it and keep repeating it.
Thanks. I think it also needs changing of promotion criteria in many faculties still. Let's see, you are having a discussion also in the chat, I see, at least in our chat, but I'm getting a sign from Vera that I have to close here, or that I have to hand back over to her. I'm really glad, so I have to admit that when I found out that this was going to be online, I was not delighted, but I think we made this work. Flávio, thanks for the tip to pin everyone. That was what saved it for me, so I could actually see you all. Well, thank you for your openness and for your contributions, and I'll hand over to Vera.